Hello everyone, and welcome to the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy in Wyoming Building Casper video series. I'm Mark Pruitt, Thermopolis Station Janitor. This is episode 8 of Building Casper, and the first operations video in the series. The last video in this series came out 5 months ago at the end of August of last year. Why the long break? Well, there were 2 reasons. First, I started extending the layout west out of Casper, so I was busy with construction. Quite frankly, I didn't want to interrupt my work to take time to produce another video. Secondly, and most important, I had been planning on doing some simulated operations in Casper Yard, but quite honestly, I couldn't figure out how to simulate operations in the yard and make it of any value to either you or me. So I decided to wait until I had extended westward far enough that westbound trains could actually depart from Casper Yard and eastbound trains could arrive in Casper Yard. Everything east of Casper still would be simulated. I finally reached the point where I thought I could produce something of value, so here we are. And with that long-winded explanation, let's get into the first operations video of Building Casper. I built westward out of Casper to Showbon, where the CNW and the Burlington split, and then continued westward to Riverton on the CNW and northwest to Thermopolis on the CB&Q. I'm not going to go into any more detail on that work, since knowing anything more than that the tracks are there isn't really important for this video. If you're interested, you can find more information about the westward expansion in the last 4 or 5 layout update videos. Part of preparing to test operations was to set up some sort of car forwarding system. I needed something other than just my whims to tell me what cars needed to go where. I chose the JMRI Operations Pro software to generate my traffic flow and car movements. There are all sorts of operations packages available out there. This was just my choice, and it's free. I spent the hours necessary to enter all my rolling stock and the towns and sidings I've finished on the layout into the program, defined a few train routes, then created a few trains within the program. I also told the program where each piece of rolling stock was starting out on the layout. After ironing out a few bugs, the program rewarded me by building very viable consists for the trains I'd defined. It generated train manifests and switch lists for the trains, telling me which cars each train needed to move and which industries they needed to move to in the towns along the routes. Armed with these manifests and switch lists, I was ready to get started. I started testing out operations in Casper on February 21st. In layout time, it's early morning sometime in the summer of 1942. The day starts by the hostler pulling locomotives for the trains originating in Casper out of the engine terminal and spotting them on the ready track. The first locomotive, CNW Consolidation 1841, will be used for the Burlington's Thermopolis loco. A CNW loco is being used today because 2 of the Burlington's mics came in yesterday needing more work than just basic servicing. What with the war heating up and the rapidly increasing traffic on the line, Casper is down to the bare minimum in terms of available motive power, so, though somewhat mortified at doing so, the division superintendent had no choice but to ask the Chicago and Northwestern if they could help out today. Fortunately, the Thermopolis loco is a bit smaller than usual, so the consolidation is sufficient to handle the train. The second train that will be going out today is the CNW's lander turn, being handled as usual by one of the line's R2 10-wheelers, number 236. While the hostler's getting the road locos ready to go, the yard crew, using an 080 number 545, is already hard at work assembling the Thermopolis train. Here's the manifest for the Thermopolis train. You can see that there's only 5 cars plus the caboose going out today, an easy load for the consolidation. The train that will return tonight will bring in almost twice as many cars, but with the easy grades on this part of the line, it will still be no problem for the 280. The first step in assembling the train is to grab a caboose called a way car on the Burlington. Today this train will be using way car 14323. Our yard crew grabs it off the caboose, or way car, track and moves it into position on the arrival and departure track. By the way, that long train to the right of the way car and switcher isn't really here yet. It's a westbound reefer express that's due in to be iced in a couple of hours. Since there's nothing east of Casper built at this point, we're pretending it's not really sitting on the main line right now. That's the simulation part of this video. With the way car in place, we go about pulling the appropriate cars from the yard and placing them into the train. As we go, you'll see the operator, me in this case, moving around, uncoupling and coupling cars, throwing turnouts, and just generally getting in the way of the camera. As the yard crew works, they have to move cars that are blocking the ones they need to other tracks, then pull the specified cars and tack them onto the train. With a bit of planning, they can minimize these types of moves. Being so mercifully short today, our train is quickly assembled and the road engine is brought out and tacked onto the front end. Unfortunately, the track arrangement in the yard results in some zigzagging back and forth to get the road engine from the terminal to the AD track. Once the train is assembled, the road crew takes over. The first thing they do is check the consist. While mistakes in assembling the train are rare, they do occasionally happen. Both embarrassment and some costs are avoided by the conductor double-checking before heading out with the train. And finally, the train is ready to depart. Yes, for these operations tests, I'm also the road crews. Bell clanging, our train works its way through the switches at the west end of the yard and out onto the main line. As the way car clears the mainline switch, the engineer opens the throttle to accelerate to mainline speed, in this locomotive around 35 miles per hour. With that reefer express due in any time, another train to assemble, and the local switching that has to be done today, the yardmaster, again me, is very happy to get the first train of the day down the road. It's still pretty early in the morning, so the day is looking good at this point. Now the yard crew turns its attention to local switching that has to get done today. This is a pretty typical day's work around here. The crew will work the local industries in between building trains and handling other priorities, like that reefer express due in shortly. We start out by pulling cars from industries along what the local crews call the East End Spur, including today's pickups from Natrona Transfer and Rocky Mountain Drilling. Often there are other cars along this spur that aren't slated to be pulled, so they have to be moved and then respotted later. The business owners aren't thrilled at the interruptions this can cause, but neither they nor the railroad can do much about it, so they coordinate to minimize the problems it causes. Today there are no cars on this spur other than the ones to be pulled, so we're lucky. We pull the cars and spot them on the classification tracks specified in the manifest. Work isn't necessarily completed in the order listed on the manifest. It's completed in such a way to minimize the moves and the time required to get it accomplished. The conductor keeps track of work accomplished as we go. Since the East End Spur is now clear, we can take the cars in the yard slated for those industries to their spots. The checkoffs on our manifest now look like this. Work on the east end spur is complete for the day. Just in time, too. It's a bit before 11 a.m. and the westbound Reefer Express arrives from Scottsbluff, Nebraska on its journey to the west coast. The local switch crew has to interrupt their local work to move these reefers to the icing tracks. This train has to be serviced and moved out as quickly as possible. The reefer's road engine, 210-6302, is cut off the train and moved to the roundhouse for inspection and light repairs. With the next engine facility over 200 miles away in either direction on the Burlington, Casper is designated as a motive power change point for nearly everything through here, even if otherwise the train wouldn't even stop. With the road engine out of the way, our plucky little 080 starts quickly disassembling the reefer train and moving it to the icing tracks. With 20 reefers in this train, the switcher will need 3 bites to move everything, since local rules only allow the movement of 8 cars at a time. The yard crews universally curse those rules. They know the engines are capable of handling a few more cars than are allowed. Why local management imposed such a rule, they don't know. Something about reduced rail adhesion of the locomotives when the tracks are wet, and reduced maintenance requirements on the locomotive, but all in all, it doesn't really make much sense to them. What management doesn't know, since they only work days, is that the night crews regularly break that rule by 1 or 2 cars. The first cut of 8 cars is pulled and moved to the far icing track. Since this train is too long for Casper's relatively short AD track, it stays on the main. This complicates the work of the switch crew by forcing some back and forth moves to get from the main to the icing track, which is off the runaround track. As well as cursing about the car limits on the switchers, the crew also curse the rail engineer who put the mainline switch off the ladder rather than off the runaround track. Our switcher makes its way back to the main line to move the second cut of cars. Finally, they get the last cut of cars. They also move the way car with this cut. They can't leave it on the main line, and since it will stay with the train through Burlington territory, they spot it temporarily on the yard's tail track off the runaround, far enough down to not interfere with other moves. This last cut of 4 reefers is then moved to the icing tracks. Even though all 4 reefers could be fitted onto one track, they split the cut to place 2 reefers on each track. The icing crews work both sides of the platform at once, moving down the entire platform length. So it's more efficient to work the same number of cars on each track than to work 1 full track and 1 partial track. And efficiency is everything on these Reefer Express trains. This one is full of sides of beef headed from Chicago to the naval base in Puget Sound near Seattle for shipment to the Pacific Theater of War to feed our boys fighting out there. It has to move as quickly as possible. With an hour or so needed to ice the reefers, our switch crew takes the opportunity to assemble the CNW train to Riverton and Lander. This train is pretty typical today. It usually runs 4 to 6 cars out, and today it's 4. Somewhat in contrast to the motive power situation, the CNW has a caboose shortage in Casper. All their cabooses were pulled to support heavier wartime traffic on the CNW's main lines, leaving the locals with nothing on this end of the cowboy line. Fortunately, the Great Northern and Northern Pacific had a few they could spare, so they wound up here in Casper, at least for a while. Our train is slated to use GN Caboose X270 today. Not in the best shape and certainly no palace car, but it is serviceable. Still, the CNW crews are looking forward to getting their own cabooses back in the near future, as the CNW's car shops feverishly produce new ones. The switch crew makes short work of assembling the train. All that's left is to tack on the road engine and take off at the scheduled time after the Reefer Express has left Casper. Our switch crew takes a very short lunch break eating next to their locomotive. They wolf down the last few bites because the reefers are fully iced and ready to be put back into their train. The reefers need to be reassembled into the train in reverse order of disassembly so that the cars are all in the same order as they were when the train arrived. Our crew doesn't know why, only that that's what they're supposed to do. So they keep track when they disassemble the train and very carefully reverse those moves to put the train back together properly. The first cut, with the caboose, is moved to the far east end of the main line, just clear of the east end switch to the yard. With the reefer train being reassembled, Mikado 5501 was being pulled out of the roundhouse and prepped to take over head end duty. The roundhouse foreman was hoping that 6302 would need only some light lubrication and such, but one of the left side main rod bearings looks questionable, and it will take longer than they have to make sure it's okay, so she won't be able to resume pulling the train. Not really an issue, but the foreman wanted to keep 5501 in reserve in case another loco developed a problem. As it is, until 6302 is declared fit for service sometime late tomorrow at the earliest, he has no reserve road power in the roundhouse. Tonight will be a sleepless night. Still, with many years of experience under his belt, the foreman kept 5501 steamed up and at the ready in the roundhouse. Casper Division wasn't going to suffer train delays if there was any way he could prevent it, even with several of his other road engines down for repair. So with less than an hour to make her ready, 5501 backs out of the roundhouse and onto the turntable. If it hadn't been for the loco shortage, she or one of her sisters would already have been waiting to go on the ready track. Since the CNW local's engine, 236, was already there, they got that crew out a bit early and moved the 10-wheeler to her train as 5501 was heading for hers. Zigzagging back and forth through that cursed track arrangement to the main line, 5501 made her way to her train and coupled up. After the briefest possible delay to pump up the air and test the brakes, our Reefer Express pulls out of Casper, bound for the west coast. The next scheduled stop, other than for coal and water, is Laurel, Montana, where the reefers will be re-iced and a fresh locomotive will be assigned. 5501 will be serviced per the agreement with the Northern Pacific and will return to Casper pulling another, as yet unknown, train. Back to our local working Casper yard, our switch crew has assembled all the trains going out today and handled the Reefer Express. With no other inbounds due during their shift, they turn back to servicing the local industries. It's about 1:30 p.m., and they start by collecting the tank cars destined for the loading racks at the Standard Oil Refinery on the west end of town. Meanwhile, the CNW train waits for its departure time, the train sitting on the AD track and the engine crew lounging on the ground away from the stifling heat of the backhead in the cab. They're leaning against the forward tender truck, napping in the shade the tender body affords. The conductor back in the caboose also is taking a short nap. At the refinery, our crew spots the arriving cars on the number 2 track. Then they pull the 4 cars that are ready to go off the number 1 track. It's unusual to see these tracks so empty, especially given the wartime footing everyone is on these days. Usually the tracks are full, with long strings of empties waiting to take their place. Often the loading racks are serviced twice a day, once in the morning and again about 12 hours later, give or take. But the refinery is barely idling along right now, with most of its fractionating towers undergoing some much needed maintenance. In about 10 days that will be over, and so will the lull in shipments. Departure time finally rolls around for the CNW local to Riverton and Hudson. The 460 eagerly moves out with her train in tow as the yard switcher moves the tanks pulled from the refinery into the yard. The 4-car train isn't a heavy load for our sprightly 10-wheeler, and she'll make excellent time all the way to Showbond. From there she'll be limited to about 25 miles per hour by the condition of the track. Still, she'll easily make Riverton by 5 p.m. The crew will spend the night at the local Fleabag Hotel, then switch both Riverton and Hudson tomorrow. The train will be back in Casper about dusk. 3 days later, they'll do it again. The local switcher runs around the tanks from the refinery and spots them in the yard on their assigned tracks. Once the tank cars are dealt with, our manifest is looking nearly complete. 2 more industries to switch, and we'll be able to call it a day. We pull the first 2 cars, the covered hoppers bound for the Wyoming concrete producer's spur. These newly developed covered hoppers are really something, but that one sure looks like something happened to it, doesn't it? We run around the hoppers to get the engine on the right side to service the spur, deliver the cars, and pick up the one from Schultz Walter Company Grocers. We spot the boxcar in the yard. We take one last look at our manifest to make sure we haven't missed anything. The conductor checked off each task as we did it, and everything is checked, so it looks like we're done. We may get off a bit early today, a rare event indeed. One last job before heading home for the night. We have to park our loco on one of the garden tracks. She'll be left with the fire slowly dying. Around midnight, while she still has enough steam, the roundhouse crew will move her to the inbound track where they'll dump her fire and replenish water and coal. They'll give her a good once-over, looking for any impending problems. Since tossing around 8 car cuts isn't overly taxing on her mechanism, she often runs for weeks with little maintenance other than daily lubrication. If no problems are found, the roundhouse crew will rebuild a small fire so she'll stay warm and be ready to go with little additional preparation in the morning. Meantime, the nighttime yard crew will use her sister, 080 number 540, for their work. Number 545 will be waiting for us early tomorrow. Half an hour to stoke the fire and build up steam, and she'll be primed for another day's work. So, what did I learn in this first operation test of the yard? 2 main things, both of which I alluded to during the video. First, the caboose track is very inconveniently placed. It should be off the runaround track, not way down at the far end of the yard off the AD track. Second, the geometry of the west end switch off the main, at the ladder rather than the runaround track, is problematic and complicates switching moves off the main. With the longer through trains sitting on the main rather than the AD track, this creates a lot of extra back and forth moves to get from the main line to the icing track particularly. The solution is to either relay the tracks in the area to fix the problem, or simply not allow any trains to be switched from the main, reducing the maximum train length by 3 or 4 cars. Longer through trains will only change motive power, and they could still hold the main. If I rearrange the west end switch off the main, that might also realign the drill track a bit, enough to place a new caboose track between it and the inbound turntable lead. But to do that, I would probably have to shift the entire yard ladder and run around east, or to the left, about 6 inches. That would also mean realigning tracks to the icing platform and the east end spur. In short, that would be a lot of work, and Casper would be out of commission for probably over a month. An alternative, and certainly simpler way to fix the problem, may be to extend the AD partway around the curve at the east end of the yard and somehow shift the caboose track to accommodate that. I'll explore that possibility a bit further. All in all, I think I'll leave things as they are for now and see how it goes. If Casper becomes a serious bottleneck during regular operating sessions, and I think a realignment of some sort will relieve it, then maybe I'll give it a go. Testing out operation of the yard proved to be a lot of fun. No weaknesses other than the two I already mentioned were apparent. At this point, I'm not sure I'll do any more operations testing on the yard. There are certainly a lot of variations I could run, adding passenger operations, loading up the refinery, adding eastbound through trains and reefer runs, and so on. But I'm not sure they would add much to what I've already learned. It might be best to just wait for regular operating sessions to begin and take notes from those. Casper isn't finished yet, so neither is this series. In the relatively near future, I'll put together the already promised construction episode on wiring the yard and moving it from New Jersey to Wyoming. Beyond that, additional episodes will revolve around as yet incomplete work, the addition of more detailed scenery, structures, and such. That work, and so those episodes may be some time off, as right now I'm more focused on extending track work on other parts of the layout. Thanks again for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this dive into operations in the yard. Stay healthy, stay safe, have fun, and keep on railroading. See you soon.